This is Paul Marnie of terrastendo.net, and this is a presentation I gave at the Animal Activist Forum in Melbourne on 15th October 2017. The title is The Reef and Other Victims of Animal-Based Food Consumption, and this is part 1. The presentation looks at some of the impacts of animal-based food consumption, including in this part 1, land clearing within Australia. In part 2, we look at destruction of Great Barrier Reef corals arising from livestock production. And in part 3, the failure of major Australian environmental groups to address these issues. Finally, in part 4, the impact on animals of replacing high greenhouse gas emissions animal-based foods with lower emissions animal-based foods. And also some new perspectives on the massive extent of animal slaughter within Australia and overseas. So this part 1 deals with Australian land clearing. In a moment we'll look at a short video released by the Wilderness Society showing drone footage above Olive Vale Cattle Station in far north Queensland. Before that, I'll show you some still images from that video, just highlighting some particular aspects. This image shows a patch of trees surrounded by a very large cleared area. On the left of the image is a bulldozer, and something not quite so obvious is that coming along behind the bulldozer is a massive chain wrapping around the trees in the foreground. Something else you can't see in the image is a second bulldozer which is also attached to the chain. And what's happening here is that the two bulldozers move across the landscape with the chain coming behind, pulling trees down in their wake. This image also shows the bulldozer, and again we have the chain coming along behind, wrapping around trees. And the large tree in the foreground is just commencing its descent. This method of land clearing is being credited by the Wilderness Society to the former long-term Premier of Queensland, Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen. It's been used for decades to devastating effect. Here we see the two bulldozers, and again the chain coming along behind. We'll now look at the Wilderness Society's footage. This is Olive Vale Cattle Station in far north Queensland. You can see the patch of trees in the middle surrounded by a very large cleared area, and in a moment we'll see the two bulldozers moving across the landscape, pulling trees from the ground as they proceed. And here you see them. A critical aspect of livestock's greenhouse gas emissions is that the emissions from livestock-related land clearing are not attributed to the agriculture sector in the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory. Instead, they're classified under a heading Land Use Change and Forestry. That's in line with international practice, but it means that here and elsewhere, livestock production's greenhouse gas emissions are significantly understated. There are other reasons for that, but land clearing is a critical one. Carbon that's stored in the trees is eventually released as CO2 after clearing. So it's adding to the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Carbon is also released from the soil at the time of clearing, and there's an increased loss of carbon from the soil subsequently because of the erosion that occurs because of the clearing. And of course there's a massive loss of wildlife habitat. Animals are an inherently and grossly inefficient source of nutrition, which means that we use far more resources, including land, than would otherwise be required. So that's the Wilderness Society video, and now we'll look at a chart which depicts the extent of clearing in Queensland For 28 years, from 1988 to 2016. These figures are from the state government's statewide land cover and tree study, known as SLATS for short. Importantly, broad-scale clearing was introduced decades before the beginning of this chart, but the SLATS figures go back to 1988. It's also important to note that 91% of the clearing in Queensland during that period was for pasture or livestock grazing, and the figure in the most recent period, 2015-16, was 93%. The clearing had increased 36% from 2014-15 to 2015-16. Also importantly, 40% of the clearing in 2015-16 occurred in Great Barrier Reef catchments. And we'll talk in part 2 about the massive impact of livestock grazing on Great Barrier Reef's corals. The clearing in those areas was up 45% from the previous year. Now you'll notice on the right of the chart there's a dip in the figures. The reason for that was that the broad-scale clearing was partially banned in Queensland with effect from the end of 2006. Unfortunately, that ban was removed by the Conservative Liberal National Party government of Campbell-Newman in 2013. It was the Labor Party government that banned clearing in 2006. The current Labor government has sought to reintroduce the ban, but it's a minority government and so far has not had sufficient numbers in Parliament to do so. But the problems are not only occurring in Queensland. For example, in New South Wales, the Conservative Liberal Party government there in 2016 repealed the Native Vegetation Act, and that repeal took effect from August 2017. And an increase in clearing, including livestock-related clearing, is almost inevitable as a result. It was in anticipation of legislative changes such as these that the Worldwide Fund for Nature listed Eastern Australia as one of 11 global deforestation fronts for the period to 2030. Not a proud record for Australia, and not a proud record for Eastern Australia in particular. To add some context to these figures, we'll look at a map briefly of some Melbourne suburbs. This map shows suburbs to the east and north of Melbourne's Central Business District. If I was standing in the middle of the CBD at Melbourne Town Hall, as I was when I first gave this talk, and if I were to draw a line 10 kilometres directly east, or 6 miles directly east, it would take me through East Melbourne and Richmond and Hawthorn and all the way out to Canterbury and Balwyn. If we would assume that the land north of that line was not streets and houses and shops and schools, but rather forest and other wooded vegetation, and if we wanted to clear that land, how far north do you think that 10 kilometre wide tract of land would extend in order to show the amount of livestock related clearing that occurred in Queensland in that 28-year period from 1988? In order to answer that question, we need to look at a map of Australia, because that 10 kilometre wide tract of land would extend all the way from Melbourne in the south to Cairns in tropical far north Queensland. That's a distance of more than 2,300 kilometres. But that's not the end of it, because that line, that 10 kilometre wide tract of land, would extend all the way back to Melbourne again, then all the way back to Cairns, and finally all the way back to Melbourne. That means that the area cleared for livestock production in Queensland in one 28-year period was equivalent to a 10 kilometre wide tract of land running between Melbourne and Cairns 4 times. And as we saw, the clearing in Queensland is once again accelerating. Some of that clearing was of regrowth, but that's a critical issue because climate scientist Dr. James Hansen and research colleagues have said that we will not achieve critical climate change targets without massive reforestation and changes in agricultural practices. Dr. Hansen, by the way, was head of climate science at NASA for many years, retiring recently. Another way to look at this is to look at it in the context of rugby fields, comparing it to rugby fields, because rugby union and league are popular sports in Queensland. And the area cleared for livestock production in that period was equivalent to more than 11 million rugby fields, 11.2 million in fact. In 2015-16, the rate was 50 rugby fields per hour, and for the full period, 42 per hour. If you're more familiar with American football, the figure was 17.5 million American football fields, or 79 per hour in 2015-16, and 71 per hour for the entire period. This map shows an area known as the Brigalow Belt, named after a form of acacia tree which is prominent throughout the region. The Brigalow Belt stretches from north of Townsville in Queensland down through southern Queensland into New South Wales. The Brigalow Belt is classified as a threatened ecological community under the Federal Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. The vegetation once extended across an area of more than 96,000 square kilometres, distributed amongst more than 10,000 patches. Each patch covered an area on average of 9.3 square kilometres. The larger the patch, the more resilient and robust is the vegetation against hazards such as fire. So what's happened since then? The area has been reduced by 87% to less than 13,000 square kilometres, distributed amongst more than 48,000 patches, with each one being only 0.3 of a square kilometre. This is similar to what's occurred in the Amazon basin, where livestock production has had a massive impact, making large areas of the rainforest in the Amazon far more vulnerable to fire and other hazards. The issue in respect of the Brigalow Belt was discussed recently on the national broadcaster ABC on the RN Breakfast program in an interview with Dr. Rod Fensham from the University of Queensland. Dr. Fensham was asked why this clearing had occurred. His answer was simple. Because it's of little productive value in its natural state, he said, although it's got enormous biodiversity value, and in its cleared state it yields productive pasture for cattle production. Dr. Fensham went on, the very most important thing is to make sure that none of the remaining remnants are cleared. But the remnants are in trouble from far more than just clearing, because they get filled up with the exotic grasses that grow on the cattle pastures, and that makes them really flammable, and fires chew away at the little remnants, bit by bit. So this is a critical issue for climate change and other aspects of the environment. We will not overcome the climate crisis without addressing the issue of animal agriculture. We also must address fossil fuels, but action in that regard will be a waste of time unless we also address animal agriculture. Thank you for listening. That's the end of part 1. And in part 2, we look at the Great Barrier Reef, and then parts 3 and 4 look at other aspects, including the issue of environmental groups and also the massive extent of animal slaughter. Thanks for listening. I look forward to talking to you further in parts 2, 3 and 4.